I am so glad that we are doing another conversation on race with Jack and Sunyatta. I'm still not getting it quite right.
Sunyatta.
So I want to give a couple of pieces of background, and then so as many of you know, maybe 4 weeks ago, we published an article that was titled, "Is Senior Living the Most Racist Industry in America?" And it was designed to be somewhat provocative, not that it was an untrue statement, because as we all know, most of the senior management and even middle management, property management at the property level is mostly Anglo, and most of the frontline staff is non-white. And I do believe that we didn't sort of set out to do that, but it doesn't, because it's evolved that way because of society and economics, doesn't mean that that's something that we should live with. And so we decided that we should have these conversations on race, because there's so much conversation, there's so much shouting at each other. And the goal really here is to have you guys talk about your experience, and you guys are very unique. So I'll give a little background. Jack is the founder of a company called Luminant that has done some work with senior living foresight, and so we've known each other for 3-4 years now, I guess. And when we started talking about this, Jack reached out and said, my wife is Black, and we probably have some things to say, and she's done a lot of this, and I don't know whether she'd talk, but it would be pretty interesting. And so that led to some further discussions, and here we are today. The one other thing I want to sort of set as a background is, over the last 4 or 5 days, I've sent out several thousand invitations through LinkedIn to this event. And what was fascinating to me is I got a message back from somebody just yesterday that was so insensitive and so I don't know. It made me so upset, and I realize, and it makes me realize why these conversations are so important. I'm quite sure that person will not be watching today, will not watch this, and they should, except that they probably would get mad. But for me, what it was is a reminder of why this is so important. And so with that, I am going to start asking you to talk, but Sunyatta, I'd like to actually have you talk a little bit about your business first, because you're doing something really cool, some really cool stuff. And so it's outside of senior living, but I can hardly wait to go check it out when we can go travel again.
Okay. Hi, I'm Sunyatta Amen, and I am the TEO of Calabash Tea and Tonic in Washington, D.C. We have a couple of locations. We pride ourselves on helping modern people reconnect with traditional ways of healing. So that's primarily herbal. I'm an herbalist, a 5th-generation herbalist. I'm a naturopathic physician, and my industry is really, I think, on the brink of an even bigger quantum leap, as evidenced by places like Whole Foods, et cetera. I grew up in a health food store. My parents owned a place in Manhattan, and actually 3, and then they were the largest distributors of herbal products in New York for a couple dozen years. So I'm kind of steeped, pun intended, in the natural world and of tea, et cetera. So that's what we do. We have a vegan cafe and tea house here in DC.
She's being very modest. She is the highest rated business of any type on Yelp in the entire Washington, D.C. area. And if you don't think that's hard to achieve, you haven't spent much time on Yelp. Because those people are vicious.
They're a little.
The other thing I would add is if you Google her name, which you should do, you will see all kinds of wonderful accolades, and she's been on national TV and radio and the newspaper, and so it's pretty impressive to have you here. I'm really, frankly, I'm really humbled. Though one thing is you were talking.
Yeah,
it's pretty impressive that she's sitting next to me. That's what's really impressive.
It is. I'm not sure how you manage that, to tell you the truth. You're obviously
can't figure it out either, right? But you know, you just got to go with it. So.
He's great. I like a smart guy. I like a nerd.
So you know what? About sort of before we get into the topic at hand, the one thing I actually was just thinking as you were talking about what you're doing is you have a whole new business opportunity to go out and for maybe franchise in some way or license what you're doing in some of these big senior living communities. I think you could really revolutionize that. In fact, I work with one of the big with Morrison Foods. And if you don't mind, I shouldn't be doing this right on TV, but here we are. I ought to connect you with them because I think there could be really an interesting opportunity there. So I'll make that connection afterwards. So anyway, so
you say that, Steve, because we were looking for a potential new location in the bottom of a senior living facility here in DC. It didn't work out for various reasons, but we thought it was an excellent marriage.
I personally grew up with my grandparents, and my great-grandmother was my original teacher of herbal medicine, a Cuban woman who had immigrated to Jamaica, and she was the village healer of her village. So I spent a lot of time with the older people in my family and benefited from it tremendously. So my thought to be involved on the ground floor, literally, of some of these senior living buildings was in my mind because I absolutely love coming in contact with, exchanging ideas with people who are probably over 70. They just have so much experience and wisdom that, and the gardening aspect and the herbal medicine, all of that a lot of them have a handle on it because they remember their parents had a garden, or they had a garden, or they used certain herbal remedies or folk remedies. So we have lots to talk about.
Yeah, I think it could be. To me, it seems like a real natural marriage. And like I say, once we get off this, I will make that connection for you. And there could be something really cool there. But I want to come back. Let's talk a little bit about. You guys are very unique. It's certainly much more common to see mixed race couples, to see couples with Black people and white people together than it used to be. I mean, when I was a kid growing up, I'm a little older than both you guys. When I was a kid growing up, it was almost something that was, I wouldn't, in the part of the world I grew up in, I wouldn't say it was scandalous, but it was still, it was so unusual that you might hardly ever see it. And when you did, it would really take you back. And there's still some of that today. So why don't you talk about what it's like to be a biracial couple? And I'm going to shut up now.
And I don't know. It's interesting. I mean, Steve, I grew up in South Carolina, right? So I could probably count on one hand the number of interracial couples I saw growing up. I mean, there were definitely, when I was in high school, there were Black women I was interested in, but it just wasn't done. It wasn't done. There was, I think, one interracial couple in my entire public high school, and it was a quite integrated, about 50-50 high school. So that just gives you a sense of what it was like, growing up in South Carolina in the 70s. I have to say, in DC, it's so common.
Yeah.
I don't even think it's an issue. Where it is an issue, Steve, is all the learning that I have to do. And I think Sunyatta will tell you that for somebody who grew up in the South, I have amazingly non-racist parents, about as non-racist as they could be. I mean, I always tell the story about my mom washing my and my brother's mouth out with soap when we were little kids using the N-word. She did not tolerate that at all. And
to be clear, you were calling each other.
That's what we were calling it. Right. And she never wanted to hear that. And we got the message pretty quick. But more importantly is we went to public schools in the South. And so we knew we had really good friends who were Black when we were growing up. And I think that was unusual given sort of my personal socioeconomic status in the South. and what's weird for me is that from elementary school until college and beyond, my social circle got increasingly white, increasingly less diverse, and it was never an intentional thing. It just kind of happened, and I don't even really know. And then, I went to law school out in Oregon and lived in Alaska for a while, and those are pretty white places to begin with. But I think I learn constantly from Sunyatta about the challenges I do that she faces as a Black woman in this society. And even though I thought I was relatively progressive on issues of race before I met her, every day my eyes are opened, just seeing what she has to go through. And this is the kind of the concept of the Black tax that I was hoping to get Ayanna to talk about a little bit, sort of at the end last week. So I don't know, baby. Tell me how am I doing? Am I
learning? You definitely are. I think if I can dovetail into what you're saying, you definitely are. There's an understanding that comes from living amongst people of diverse backgrounds and creeds, colors, etc., that is absent in homogeneous environments where you don't have other perspectives, etc. And in addition, people of color, and I like to use that term because it encompasses more than just Black people. I myself am, encompassed of more than just what is standardly thought of as Black people in this country. My father's family is very Native American from Northern Virginia, and Southern Virginia, Northern North Carolina, and they're very connected to their tribe there, and so there's a lot there. What I think is that people of color are not monolithic. We don't exist as one set of people, and one of the issues that can happen in and I'll just speak from my perspective in hospitality, because I'm in the hospitality industry, and I dare say that there are lots of aspects of hospitality that people don't necessarily think are hospitality. Lots of the people I went to school with, for example, whether it's undergraduate or graduate, went on to be allopathic physicians. So most of them are MDs, DOs, or dentists or the like. And that in of itself is a hospitality industry. It is medicine, but you're only as good as your most happy patient. You're only as good as the person who says, this was great service. It's customer service. And that starts the minute you walk into a waiting room. From my perspective in hospitality, it's difficult enough. And anyone who's ever done something like work in a doctor's office or waited tables at the other end of it, or whatever's going on, it's already hard enough to make sure that people always feel welcome, that your customers or clients, in your case, do you call them clients, the folks who are
residents? We call them residents.
Okay.
Yeah.
That everyone feel welcome. They feel that they're being reached. You're reaching people exactly where they are. And for my business in particular, we pride ourselves and some of the things that Jack mentioned, in our write-ups that people talk about us, is that it's sort of like a United Nations of customers. You see someone from there's a representative being sent every day from every contingency. And one of the reasons why people have such a great time in our space is that it's a safe space. We've created safe spaces where people feel free to talk about whatever it is. Conversations like this can take place, conversations about the weather. We can have a workshop on herbs where people are blending their own tea and they're working side by side. And I encourage collaborative learning and collective theory. So they have to work in groups to make it happen. And that free exchange of energy and ideas and experiences makes a really rich tapestry where our customers, or in your case, your residents, or in a doctor's office, their patients or clients, everyone feels like their opinion is valued and their experience and experiences, and specifically we're talking about here in America, are heard and at least considered.
Okay, I had no idea I was gonna ask this because I didn't know I was gonna get this email yesterday. And
It seems to be the thing. I want to hear this.
Terrible, because it was, frankly, it was so offensive, and yet it was her view, right? And I did write a long, impassioned plea back, not plea, but sort of a counter argument. But frankly, and then she responded back, but I don't think we moved the needle at all. So I guess my question to you is, and I sort of hate to ask this, right? Because one of the things I hear, and I think it's sort of right, is, go figure it, kind of, don't ask me to solve your problems, right? But I don't know what to do. So how do we actually have this conversation where maybe where you can have some level of respect for because it is their opinion, and move the needle? Any thoughts on that?
It's interesting. I mean, the very first thing that I do, let's backtrack just a little bit to a specific incident. Maybe that helps, right? So, and it wasn't our incident, but we were asked about it. So Starbucks, maybe a year and a half ago, maybe it's 2 years ago, had an incident in the Philadelphia area where two gentlemen were in their store, not my store, but they were in their store, and they sat down and set up their stuff, and one of the gentlemen asked to use the restroom. So he asked for the key. The woman behind, who was the manager, she said, well, you need to buy something in order to use the restroom. And he's like, well, I definitely will, but I really got to go. And they were clearly set up. He said he was there for a meeting, whatever the case is. He again said, well, if I could just use I am coming back, or my friend will come up and order. She chose to call the police, even though it had not escalated any further than that. And people had it on camera. The gentleman hadn't argued back and forth. She called the police, and the police chose to arrest the gentleman. So the long story short is that Starbucks was very apologetic. They had to have they closed all their stores for a day, I think, and had a training in sensitivity. Now, because of that, NPR came calling to me, and lots of the things that I have done in terms of other radio shows, television, all of that, PBS NewsHour, whatever, I just wanted to talk about it because we are known at Calabash for creating an environment where that wouldn't necessarily have happened. And if it did, I'd have to hem up my staff member on that, because it's just not the way things are done. So the moment that someone is hired with us, and we've had people of all backgrounds, socioeconomic and racial, we first talk about assuming the best. And so when you have a perspective of assuming the best with someone that you're dealing with, these kind of things don't happen. So the worst case scenario is what? The gentleman used a restroom and then he packed up all his stuff that was on the table and then left. I mean, he's a real estate agent, and so was his friend, and they were there for a meeting about a property, $1 million property, by the way. And this woman had judged him by the fact that he arrived on his bike and he had on a t-shirt, or I don't know, whatever. And I think that when you walk into a situation in hospitality, so whether it's in assisted living, whether it's in a restaurant, whether it's in a cafe or a doctor's office or whatever, assuming the best is always the policy. It's just good for business. It's good for the fabric of the company, and it comes from the top down. So when someone comes in, we make sure that our staff we have these conversations before they're hired, so that when a customer comes in, when a guest comes in, we already have in our minds the best case scenario, and our job is to navigate the best case scenario.
So Steve, can I jump in here? Because I think the issue here is with white people being willing to look at their own assumptions, right? I mean, first, there's been a lot of talk about white privilege, and that's just the idea that as a function of being a white person in this society, things are easier. The opposite of white privilege is the black tax. And that's the idea that just if you are black or a person of color in this society, everything is harder because of that set of unconscious assumptions that people make about you because of the color of your skin. And those assumptions are pernicious, right? I mean, they are, this person isn't as smart. They grew up in the ghetto. I mean, I think you were, maybe when we were talking earlier in the week, you gave that example, right? And
Yep.
And even if you did, so what, right?
Yep.
It doesn't have anything to do with the content of your character. It doesn't have anything to do with your intelligence. And what I see with Sunyatta is that she's one of the smartest people I've ever met, and she has to, but the level of work that she has to do to overcome those sort of the deck being stacked against her is exhausting. And it's physically, it's mentally, it's emotionally exhausting. And it's one of the reasons that you see that Black people in particular in the society have higher rates of high blood pressure. They have worse outcomes. It's probably why they're getting hit a lot harder by the coronavirus, because the society doesn't value them. And the internalization of that ends up leading to health problems, right? So these are the kinds of things that we as white people have to be willing to examine and correct within ourselves. And if folks aren't willing to examine that, you're not going to get very far with that conversation, right? We need to spend our time on the people who at least are open to having the discussion, because folks who aren't open to having the discussion, you're not going to get anywhere with them.
Yeah, I think that's really the important part. And, when this woman said, well, I'm not coming to your session, I thought it doesn't make any difference because you're not really open to changing. But the reason people are interested in these conversations is because they're looking at the disparities that are out there and saying, I think the biggest challenge, and I think particularly in senior living, is most people, in fact, would acknowledge that this racial disparity that we see in senior living is a problem. And it's not just in the workplace. Most senior living residents are Anglo. There are a few communities on the West and the East Coast that are sort of Chinese flavored. I suspect that there are some low-income communities in the South that are probably, in the Deep South, that are probably mostly Black, and probably in places like Texas and some of those places mostly Hispanic. But I'm not aware of many senior living communities that are sort of upscale that would be, primarily Black. I do understand that Kendall actually has one in the DC area that's very, very is very, very mixed, has a variety. Diversity is the word I'm looking for, and we're actually hoping maybe get them involved in these conversations.
Yeah.
So
sometimes it helps. At least I find that, like in my work, it helps to have firm examples and of the disparity that takes place, because of course it's easy for us to say, well, this is America. Everyone has the opportunity to pull themselves up by the bootstraps. How about this Black figure and that Black person and this person of color and that, person. And those things sometimes don't, that way of thinking doesn't really take into consideration that those people are actually, the exception in a lot of cases. And it has, and as Jack said, it doesn't always have to do with, how you're brought up or what, both of my parents are college professors. My mom's an NYU grad. My dad went to Columbia. I mean, it shouldn't be that it's easier for me, but I'm going to use that myself as an example to say to you that, as a kid who went to private school, as a kid whose parents were, business owners and professors, and at NYU and at Carnegie Mellon and all these, highfalutin places, that even so, things are not easy necessarily. And what we call the black tax is really the fact that my SAT scores have to be 10 times as high, you know what I mean? Or my walking into, let's just use a business as an example, having an award-winning business that, maybe like the last 8-9 years, we've won Best of DC. And as Jack mentioned, all these other accolades, whatever, let's just put that into the mix to say that even with those laurels, even with that, going into a rental situation, like going to rent a new locational space for us, was the last time was tremendously difficult. And what's interesting is that in the meeting for the lease signing, which I had to really force forward because we were waiting to apply for.
It was a grant deadline.
It was a grant deadline for like outer, just like your sprucing up city grant or whatever. And both the mayor's office and all these other folks wanted us to apply for this because we would be a feather in their cap, right?
We already had an award-winning first location, trying to get the second location.
And so this would have been this was our third actual location. And so going into that meeting with letters from the deputy mayor and from my prior landlord and my current landlord, and I mean, a dossier of information, including our financials, all the things that I needed to get it done, I was greeted with, all I can tell you is like
just hostility. Yeah, hostility is the word.
And the gentleman who was meeting with me is underneath the owner, right? But of the property, he said that because their properties, they have so many properties in emerging neighborhoods. Is the code that he used. It's a code for gentrified, neighborhoods. That they
used to be black, basically.
Yes, that they had to be very careful about who they rent to, and they had already had a woman of color in the space, and they didn't care for the,
didn't work out.
It didn't work out. She canceled the lease after a couple of years or whatever. But I did say to him, well, you do realize we don't all know each other, right? Like I don't actually know this lady, and so I can't be responsible for, but you are sitting there with letters from my landlord that I've had space with for 15 years and my new landlord who is a larger developer than you guys, right? Like larger than this guy who's talking to me by far. And my locations were in neighborhoods that weren't emerging, they had emerged. So these are Shaw, for example, that neighborhood where we have the location that I was giving him all this information for is one of the most gentrified and sought after neighborhoods in Washington, DC, as written by the New York Times. So, when somebody comes from another city to talk about your area, that's a big deal. But I was met with an amazing amount of hostility in this meeting, and Jack was running behind. I had
another call. I was taking that, and then I was running up to this meeting. So I got off the call. I started listening to the meeting that she was in with the property manager
he was on the conference until he arrived.
And I could not believe the way he was talking to her.
This guy hadn't met Jack yet. So he didn't know who he was, but he couldn't believe it.
But we had a black real estate agent who was a friend of Sunyatta's, and he didn't know that a white guy was in the mix, right? A white guy lawyer, by the way, too.
Right. Yeah.
So when I walked in, I was listening to the call up the moment I walked in the room. And as soon as I walked in the room, his tone and tenor changed completely. It turned into a different meeting.
Yeah.
He got onto the back foot because I essentially upbraided him. But everything with this guy was met with suspicion. And like we were trying to pull a fast one on him.
It was amazing.
It was unreal.
And we had already negotiated. I'll just give you an example of this kind of weird thing that happens. We had already negotiated a certain price, and I just needed the lease, the LOI signed, not even the lease, just the LOI signed by them, just the letter of interest on our part, so that in exercising site control, I could apply for the grant, and that was due by noon. This guy was stretching it out. It's already 11, it's 11:30, it's 11:45. And then he said to me, well, if you want it signed, we're going to have to revert back to the original pricing. And I'm like, what? Who negotiates backwards? Like, what kind of arrangement is this? So long story short, the grant deadline was extended, and the grant office texted me. They say, oh, you have until 5 o'clock. And that's when I just said, okay, we have until 5 o'clock. Now it's you and me. And we just went through it. He was like, oh no. But I was like, okay, we have until 5 o'clock, and I'm going to use all your time. And so we got it done like that after that. But the idea that he was railroading me when he thought I was by myself, the fact that he had it on 12, he was actually yelling at me. I haven't had anybody, my parents don't even speak to me like that. And when Jack walked in the room, it went from 12 to 4. He went on to, okay, let's sit down and talk about it. He had to collect himself. Now, if you think we're being extra sensitive about this, because sometimes people are very sensitive, and there's reasons for that too, and it's rightly so. But once this guy got a new boss, the new boss came to us with their PR person and said that they wanted to apologize for this guy's behavior. And that was all of like 6 months later. But I was like, it had gone out. It had gone out.
Yeah,
like,
and there's another, I mean, we don't want to just keep beating with this guy.
But that wasn't the only interaction. And every interaction was just amazingly difficult. And this wasn't my first rodeo by far. I've been in this industry for, I don't know, 25 years, and grew up with my parents, doing, having businesses. I couldn't imagine. But the fact that they came to us to apologize shows that they didn't want that PR. They didn't want that story being told. They realized that he was out of order. And I'm just saying that to say that that's part of that black tax, which is just the way he spoke to me shook me. Like it upset me emotionally. Like for days, I just kept going. You go back to something like, I don't know if I like the way this guy, I couldn't even rest for like a week because it was so abrasive and unnecessary. It was very aggressive. And all I can say is that, that also goes to the point of certain people should deal with clients, customers, et cetera, because that in and of itself is a customer service job, and some people just should not. But it almost killed the deal. Even though we had the money to go into the space, even though what we created was now been lauded as one of the most beautiful restaurant spaces, like it's been written up everywhere. The new space, the space I was arguing with this dude, and I wasn't even arguing about, that now it's a feather in their cap. They were emailing out press releases that they're so happy to have us there, and it's like, so now we're a jewel in the crown. And just imagine the lift it takes to build a space and then run a space and then give it that reputation. But I was starting with a damaged nervous system just from dealing with this guy over and over again. I'm like, to the point where I had to call them and say, look, I can't deal with this guy anymore. If you want me to do this, you gotta. And he doesn't even work there now.
Right. Here's the thing. But that our interaction with him has transferred to the entire organization now. Right. We have, and we don't, like, if we're talking to people in the community, we don't hesitate to pull punches about them.
We won't recommend them. Right. But I would say that they did come, the gentleman who, and they apologized in their PR person and asked how they can,
unfortunately, that guy's already left because apparently the culture in this organization, right?
And that goes to speak about how on both sides of it, you can, life's hard enough. You can either meet the person where they are. If it was money that was the issue, let's negotiate, let's talk about it. But there is definitely no reason to be aggressive to someone who's actually bringing good things into the spaces. So saying all this to say that with regard to your industry, it is always important to take into account just assuming the best and treating people with that assumption creates a different kind of interaction.
Well, yeah, what I was going to say, Steve, I was going to harken back to something from the conference back in April, right, where you had Scott who talked about radical candor, right?
Yep.
The other side of that is radical empathy, right? And
I like that. Radical empathy.
That is what, if you really want to understand racism and the experiences of people of color as a white person, it requires a radical level of empathy of trying to put yourself in their shoes and in not making these kinds of assumptions that we've been talking about, and trying to see the person for who they are and not for some label that you have in your head of what you think they are, right?
Yeah.
And really, at the end of the day, it just requires treating them like a person.
Imagine that.
I know.
So I have sort of two areas that I want to maybe dig a little bit deeper into. It's actually one very short story. In this email exchange I used to run a good sized junior high school youth group when I lived in Southern California, and we were out fairly close to Redondo Beach area, but we were right on the edge of sort of south central LA, so very poor areas. And I had a number of kids who lived in those areas who came to my youth group, and I had two girls in there. They were both Hispanic. And they were top achievers. I think one was the valedictorian, maybe both of them were. And so when they graduated, they both, one went to a very sort of an Ivy type women's college on the East Coast, and the other one went to UCLA. And they both really, really struggled. They struggled because even though they were at the top of their class in this inner city high school, the education was so far below what the kids who were coming out of high school in Beverly Hills or San Jose or San Francisco had, that they struggled. But it wasn't just that. They were going into a very different society, and that they just had no idea how to act. And I think that gets so missed. And I think particularly that tends to get missed in places like senior living. One of the things I actually love about the Ritz-Carlton model of bringing on employees is, of course, they have a lot of servers and things, people who are at that sort of that equivalent level who are non-white. And they spend so much time teaching them how to, it sort of sounds badly to say sort of behave in this white environment, but it's kind of what it is. But maybe in a more moneyed environment is a better experience, and it makes their whole lives better. So how do we, so you come in and you get to talk to, I won't name any senior living companies, but you get to come in and you get to talk to the senior living management. And you come in from the perspective of saying, I've been able to create this wonderful, diverse, safe place in my restaurants, and there's so much commonality what we do, and they come to you and they say, well, teach us how to do that in our communities, knowing that you have a very flat organization, but I've got all these layers. How do I go about doing that?
That's a great question. I think it actually goes both ways, in that sitting down and having conversations about with staff. That's what I think I'm hearing you say.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
With staff about their assumptions and their understanding of who the customer, client, or resident is, and then a reality check on who they are, and that as offered by the senior staff member or trainer. The other thing that helps is understanding that as people of color, who maybe your staff members who are really doing the heavy lifting, sometimes literally, is that they have an experience, they have a validity in their culture, and that it would be worthwhile speaking that language too.
Right.
The fact that people of color are pretty much, and I say we're not monolithic, but what happens is when we talk about a moneyed environment, we're talking about back to privilege again. And so sometimes that privilege is bought with education. Sometimes that privilege is bought with money or inheritance, whatever. So there may be, as you pointed out, like a lack of exposure to that environment. But we, as people of color, are forced, if we're not already part of that group, of that moneyed set, we are then forced to have divergent experiences, right? So we have to be fluent in all the possible ways. And so sometimes not just two ways, there may be multiple levels. I need to be I need to be able to communicate with my staff who are from the Caribbean or from Africa or from the Deep South. And then they may be Northerners. They may be college students who are coming in working with us. There are so many experiences. They may be first generation in this country, and they're graduate students, or whatever the case is. So we have a very diverse. I need to speak to each one of those. There's a strata of people, a diversity there, and then I need to be able to explain to them who our customers are in every possible segment. So what this takes is a frank conversation. And if you back up from the conversation thinking, okay, well, if I have that conversation, I'm instigating, I'm instigating some racial issues or socioeconomic issues. The truth is the lack of that conversation is what actually bit Starbucks in the butt, is that if you don't that conversation, it will be a conversation and it won't be pleasant.
Well, you're not instigating the issue. The issues are already there.
The issues are there.
So the thing I was thinking about, Steve, when you were talking about the two girls that you had mentored, was they didn't speak the language, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Right. And so what Sunyatta's saying here is that people at the executive level in senior living need to learn how to speak more than one language. And that means actually caring enough to sit down and going back to the idea of treating people as a person, of trying to get down and actually have a conversation with people, because there's this whole concept of code switching, right? Where people of color, Black people, they may talk to each other in one way. They may talk to white people in another way. They have to learn how to talk white in order to succeed in this society, because people in this society view talking Black as meaning that you're unintelligent, right? Yep. So they have to learn how to speak this other language.
Or even speaking with a Southern accent. I mean, even so there's a standard that goes even for white people, that sometimes people kill their accents because, and so this
I didn't kill mine on purpose, by the way.
It flares up. So what I would say is that that kind of thing is inherited inherited behavior from a European standard, especially in Britain. There's this is lots of my family that's our background through Jamaica, et cetera, is that the idea of language being spoken as the Queen's English is so very important, that what happens is that you're judged immediately if you go to London, anywhere, you're by your accent, and they can tell regional accents, even when it may sound the same to us. Right. They can tell if someone went to Eton or if they didn't, or whatever the case, or they went to Edinburgh, where lots of my uncles were educated in Edinburgh, went there for medical school. And so there's just a different conversation that takes place, a different language, and it's just inherited. So what happens is that one of the things that America tried to get, the original colonists tried to get away from, they ended up duplicating, which is social strata based on language, social strata based on, fill in the blank. And so when we point that out as, people who want to be awake to these things, and I appreciate this conversation, Steve, because this is it may be an awakening for some people. It may confirm those other things. Yep. Is to point it out sometimes in America that, hey, there are some levels here, and in order for everyone to build this wonderful quilt that is America, we have to understand that all the fabrics are necessary, and that's what makes it beautiful, or else it's just beige and it's just kind of boring. So in the course of that, people can be criticized for talking about these levels that exist, when really that's what America was founded on, correct? Like the colonists came here to say, this is a different way of living, and people should be able to have conversations about anything. And if we are truly about America being as excellent as it can be, then you have to have those conversations. And then after the conversation, which is, a coming to Jesus moment, for some folks, then the next step is action. And that's how this country called America was born, correct? Is out of conversation. The conversation didn't get too many places, and then there was a little dust up, wasn't it? Where people threw tea into the harbor, which makes my heart sad. But people threw tea, and they were like, "You're not doing it," and whatever else. So we have to be unafraid as Americans to have conversations that include those very uncomfortable places, because that's the only way to smooth it out. We're ironing out, and you have to take it and smooth it. You cannot just skip over it. It will come back. And that's what we're seeing even now within protests, other things, it's coming back, and it comes back in a huge wave.
So I'm going to ask a question that I didn't think I'd be brave enough to ask, but I feel super safe. My yard guy was here, and I was just telling him
we created a safe space here for you.
Not go outside so we could be heard. So it feels really safe, and so I'm going to try this question with you. I have a number of friends, even some relatives, who feel a bit like the person who sent me this email that said, I think that but really what they were saying is that this is that the Black community needs to take more responsibility for solving this problem, and they point to the number of single parent families and those kinds of things. But they don't even feel safe being able to have that or start that conversation. And so I'm going to actually do that with you. And how do you respond to that? How do you respond to them? How do you react to that question?
Wait, what's the question now?
Well, the question really is this: so they're going to say, yeah, it may be unfair, but look at what the Black community is doing. 80% of the kids, 70% of the kids who are born in Black families are born without a father in the family, and until they get a handle on stopping just cranking out these kids in these terrible circumstances, and they get married and they create families, and there are even some heroes of the conservatives that are Black, Walter Williams being one of the significant one, who's got these 5 things. If you do these, you'll be successful. But they don't even feel like they can talk about those. And I understand on one hand why people get really reactionary to it, but maybe there's got to be room to actually have those conversations, because I think that we'd find better in the middle. Any thoughts?
Well, I'll let Sunyatta speak. Here's the thing: she's not speaking for the Black community; she's speaking for herself, right?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. I think the part of the problem is that, yeah, people, certainly personal responsibility is important, but you have to look at all the structural factors that create the situation in the first place. When you deprive people of the ability to have intergenerational wealth for 400 years, what do you think their circumstances are going to be? I mean, that's the biggest issue with the Black tax, right? Is that you don't have multiple generations of college graduates. You don't have people who've been able to pass down property from generation to generation, in many respects because of governmental barriers and societal barriers that kept them from doing that. Redlining of neighborhoods, for instance. So, when I hear this argument, I don't know, it really gets me angry, because it's a way of deflecting responsibility for us as white folks And it doesn't mean that, I think there are plenty of people in the Black community who are trying to lift up the Black community. But they just have a higher mountain to climb.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that as I've been thinking so much about this over the last few months is that we could largely break this cycle and solve it in a generation if we said we are going to take the poorest performing high schools where mostly kids of color, but really, not discriminatory, are living in these horrible circumstances. And we're going to put 4 times as much money into those schools. And we're going to hire the very best teachers out there. We're going to pay them double because it's going to be harder work and rewarding. And we're going to start at 6 o'clock in the morning and we're going to go to 7 o'clock at night. And we're going to teach parents how to educate their kids and how to manage their money and how to create better meals. In one generation, we could do so much, and it would be so much less money than the government is spending on poverty right now on an ongoing basis. And it just blows my mind that neither party seems to be willing to have the courage to step up and say that. So that's my box.
Yes. Wait, did we lose you?
Well,
I think
we're still there.
Oh, there it is. I love what you're saying, and it brings 2 things to mind. The first is that for some reason, every person of color is responsible for the entire community of people of color.
Yeah.
Like I said, we're not monolithic, and we don't all know each other. Although it is in my mission statement, written in our mission statement, and it's our methodology at Calabash, at our businesses, to entrench ourselves in the community, to know the history of our neighborhoods, to welcome the children who go to school across the street. They come in all the time. We trade them their stuff. They come in with a yoo-hoo. We trade them some cacao with maca or some chai, or, so it's a one-on-one. And now they come in and just ask for that stuff. They have vegan pie and they have this and they have that. And I ask about their homework and how their day is going and what they learned today, and let them sit with a pencil at the bar and do their homework. And that might be the interaction that they need, because their parents, from what I'm hearing from them, are out working. And a lot of times that work is late. And those parents may be the same people that are staff members that are working with you guys. So what happens is that latchkey children of any set end up having those challenges, and there's that. The other thing that comes into play, which is what Jack was saying, is that when we as a society negate what has happened with the kidnapping of people, bringing them to a country where other people are thrown off of their land, and the setup of an agrarian culture that requires the free labor of other people for 400 years, it takes a toll, right? And even though that may have ended 150 years ago, that's still only 2 generations. I have relatives that are 90 something. So that means that it was only, 50 years before they were born that slavery had ended. And it didn't end like, boom, it's over. All right. So there are repercussions. And if we believe in mathematics, it's just a pendulum. And once the pendulum has swung one way, it's going to take a while to swing back the other way. And it actually has to have the force of gravity to do that. So if we're standing in the way of the pendulum swinging by not acknowledging that it's a pendulum, or that there was a swing, right, or that then we're all just standing in the way and making excuses and pointing to some people of color as an example of, look how he pulled himself up, or look what happened here. So what I find most interesting with this conversation, and I'll just give you this as an example, is that my family in the United States, who came from northern North Carolina, Southern Virginia, who are mostly Native American, but they also were blended in with free people of color. And a lot of people don't know that there were free people of color in this country. Those relatives, ancestors of mine, were never enslaved. And what makes sense doing. And I'll refer you guys to a book if you like. It's a Free People of North Carolina, and it's written by actually one of my, third cousins who is a professor, a college professor. And there's lots of photos in there and all kinds of stuff. But one of the great things about coming out of that community is that you get to see the difference in education. So my greater grandparents went to, let's say, Shaw University, and then those people founded Hampton, and then those people went to, so you have multi-generations of college graduates going back to the 1850s, 1840s. That is what allowed me to be who I am right now. That's what allowed my great grandparents to own a business, for my great grandfather to be a pharmacist, for my, you know what I mean? So and that still came at a tax. My grandfather couldn't go to some of his classes. He had to get note service because they wouldn't let him in the class, even though he was the top student. Even though some of those folks in my family may have been the top in their university, grade-wise, they were not allowed to be valedictorian. Who answers for that? Who says, well, you have an opportunity. What's the big deal? That's a big deal. Not being lauded for your accomplishments can turn people off. In our case, it spurned us forward, but who's to say? So when we look at the accomplishments of a set of people who were free people of color, we see what happens when people have freedom versus when they don't.
Hey,
another thing I would say, in my generation still, we had segregation until 1963 that was government sanctioned. There were bathrooms that if you were black you couldn't use, and drinking fountains and soda counters and buses you had to sit in the back of, and those are still realities. We have hundreds of thousands of people of color that are living in this country today that experience that, and
social norms take a long time to change, right? And so people, even though you don't have de jure segregation, you have a lot of places de facto segregation. Hey, can we have a question from Michelle Koch, because I think we're almost out of time, right?
Yeah, we're almost out of town. Go ahead.
Good question.
And it's a great question, and it was actually one I was thinking about saying. So Michelle's question is: should senior living organizations put active focus on seeking more varied individual backgrounds and the people they grow / advance to leadership, so that in future there won't be so much white at the top, color on the front lines? That's exactly what needs to happen. Absolutely. And it's not affirmative action. It's actually trying to—
It's just action.
Well, what it is it's actually action. Trying to make your organization better, because just like there's research that shows that organizations make better decisions when they have women in leadership position, the same has to be true for having people of color in those same leadership positions. You're making a more considered decision because you have more perspectives at the table helping you make that decision.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So one last question for you. We talked about this before we got started. Resources, books, articles people should be reading to be better informed, to be able to build better relationships.
I really like Malcolm Gladwell's podcast, Revisionist History. He did a season. He has a theme for each season, and the season's only like 4 episodes or 5 episodes. So it's really not too much of a heavy lift. But Revisionist History is his podcast. And he did one that was specifically about race and segregation, looking at it from the lens of education. So much like what you mentioned, and his theory inside of that was, it's not just about, okay, we have better books and we have all these teachers but it's making sure that teachers who look like you are hired. Because when studies have shown that when people are caring for people who look like them or have been acclimated to people who look like them, they expect the best. So as an example, the neighborhood we live in and the neighborhood that our other location is in produced, circuit court judges and Supreme Court, state judges and doctors and lawyers and all kinds of stuff before segregation, because their teachers had a vested interest in them performing at that level. When we make sure that there's diversity at the managerial, which is teacher level, right, and at the owner level and then that creates an environment where people feel that there's growth. So if your staff it's like a pyramid, and the staff who are really doing the heavy lifting and the foundation are at the bottom, in touch with your residents every day, your customers, your clients, all of that, they have to feel that there is an opportunity to go up, and that fortifies them, bringing stronger people under them and training and adding diversity to the structure that you have. And that is what has made us able, we are able at Calabash to be an award-winning business, to be something that, the Wall Street Journal, other places write up, because what happens is you set a shining example of what happens when you knit people together and you respect all those fabrics that come together.
So I have 2 recommendations. I think for me personally, one of the most impactful books I've ever read is Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me. Just unbelievably moving. I would also say that anything by Bell Hooks is important, because Bell Hooks is probably the author who explains the experience of Black women in depth. And I think if you're going to understand the experience of a lot of the caregivers and others in senior living, you really have to get inside their world, right? And if you don't get inside their world, it's hard to have that relationship with them. It can actually lead you to be able to find people who you can move up through the ranks.
Yeah, it makes your organization better by far. And in our case, our first 2 employees at one of our flagship, locations couldn't have been more diverse.
Yeah.
The little tiny pixie of a white girl, Shannon. I love Shannon. Mm-hmm. And then we had Babatunde, who was born in Nigeria, but then came to this country, and has degrees in radiology, like masters and this and that. And they couldn't have looked more different. They couldn't have been, short and tall, Laurel and Hardy, like they couldn't have been more. And they were employee number 2 and 3 at what became our most lauded location. And it set a tone even when people walked in, like, wow, this is really, like, this is a Benetton ad of a place. But it wasn't done for show. It was because they were the best. And because they were the best, that's why I hired them. So we have to really take off those biases and really look at how we get the best people, and we retain them by letting them understand that there is upward movement, or hire them at those levels and pull from those places upward.
Yeah. Well, Jack, Sunyatta, this has been fantastic. I can hardly wait to come and visit your tea store. Can I get coffee there, though? I'm not much of a tea person. I'm in the confess.
Of course you can. We have good. Like, we have coffee. We have, my other set of my parents are from Jamaica. We have some of the world's finest coffee.
Good.
I know coffee very well. I will make your coffee myself, and I hope that we've been able to add something to the conversation about this. And I would invite folks, if they have. They can follow us they follow me anyway on social media at our shop at Calabash Tea is our social media handle for Facebook or for Instagram. And if they have questions like about those resources or books or anything, they can DM us. I would invite that. We're always open for conversation, and I hope that the person who sent you an email it was here today, and if not, is open to have a chat. I think there's something about community that is in traditional aspects considered a circle, and to push people out of the circle is, a break out of it, but to pull them in, it can only make things better. A circle's super strong, and it's always giving in a dynamic way. So I would invite them to, have conversation. Even in disagreement, we can find understanding.
Yeah. I find that when I have people who I have conversations with who have very different politics, if we're just on social media, we just go like this. But if we sit down and we have a cup of coffee or a cup of tea together, we find that we actually have a lot more. We mostly agree on things. We may have some differences about how to get there, but the big goals we actually agree on. So anyway, we're way over time. Thank you very much. This was absolutely amazing. these conversations, for those of you who watch and those of you who will watch, this is how we just, you'll hear me talk about it a lot. The one starfish at a time story is sort of old and cliche, but I actually believe it is ultimately how we change the world, is by impacting and having conversation with one person at a time. So with that, I'm going to call the broadcast to a close. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having us.